Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed."
Hi, I'm Jacob,
Hi, I'm Nina.
Hi, I'm Mike.
and this is the Fig Tree Podcast. Well, this week we are finishing the book of Genesis. We're not going to do every single book in multiple parts, but Genesis is so foundational that we felt that it was appropriate to do. So this week we're going to cover the Patriarchs and Matriarchs. So Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, Sarah, Rachel. But first, why don't we check in? How's everybody doing?
I'm doing great. How are you, Mike?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
How about you, Jacob?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. Yesterday I had jury duty. It's kind of like an extended trip to the DMV. So that was quite something.
Well, it'll be fun today to hear about your namesake
Yes.
in the book of Genesis.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's get started.
Yeah, all right. So last week, we talked about the primordial history, that kind of broad sweep of the ancient history of the world in the first half of the book of Genesis. And we talked about how things spiraled out of control for humanity, how they went further and further into trying to choose their own way, to be their own gods. And in the midst of all of this destruction, God makes a covenant with all of humanity through Noah and his family, promising never to flood the world again and giving humanity that mandate to be fruitful and multiply. Last week we mentioned that God keeps a faithful remnant through the story, from Seth to Noah to Shem, hinting that God is still not done with humanity. And this remnant, it recalls God's promise in Genesis 3:15, that one day there's going to be a promised son who will be struck by the serpent, but will crush the serpent's head. And as you remember, we talked about that being a kind of early prophecy of the Messiah. Well, as we reach this second half of Genesis, we zoom in and we find that God picks one specific family, the descendants of this guy named Abram, through whom he is going to make everything right.
So let's begin with the story of Abram and his wife Sarai. So they were a wealthy couple. They lived in what is now Iraq, and they were very near the Euphrates River. So they had everything they needed. They had lots of servants and animals and lots of things. But what they didn't have was children, and that was a problem. So in Genesis 12, God came close to Abram and said to him something that might be considered the heart of the book of Genesis, and that is, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
So that's really like the central promise of Genesis then, huh?
It is. And God promises in a covenant 3 things: to give Abram's family land, very important; to make them a great nation, which is another way of saying a lot of descendants. And we see this in nature metaphors in the book of Genesis. Like, your family will be as many as the number of stars in the sky or the grains of sand in the desert. It's so beautiful. But what is also so strange is that they end up just having 1 children. And it makes us all wonder, made them wonder, what was God talking about? So this promise then looks forward to the rest of the Hebrew Bible and how God will be with Israel. But even more, it looks forward to how God will use Israel to bless the whole world by fulfilling that promise made in Genesis 3:15. So we go through the story. We follow Abram and his wife Sarai. They end up having their names changed to Abraham and Sarah. God further elaborates the covenant with Abram, going through this covenant ratification ceremony and establishing the covenant sign of circumcision. Abram's name is then changed to Abraham, which means father of a multitude. You know, when we got to this part of Genesis in 6th grade religion class, as the teacher, I always had to make sure that the health teacher taught them about circumcision first, because I didn't want to be the one.
You know, it's funny to me because when we read it, for most people, you're circumcised when you're a baby, so you don't remember it. But, you know, what Abram had to do was he had to be circumcised at a full-grown age. So that's some extra dedication, we'll put it that way.
Absolutely. So Abraham and Sarah are quite old by our standards today. They would be considered elderly. But we have to remember that Abraham's father lived to be like over 200. And so really, if you compare it to today, they're probably about 50, which isn't elderly, in my opinion. But they're not conceiving. And so possibly they have run out of patience with God's plan. Maybe they're even doubting God's plan. So they take things into their own hands and they try to fulfill God's promise through Hagar, Sarah's servant, resulting in the birth of Ishmael. God then appears to Abraham and Sarah through these mysterious 3 men. And Sarah has this lovely demonstration of hospitality for them. And she overhears them talking, that they are promised a son through her, and she laughs at them, and they know that she's laughing. So then Sarah does conceive, and she gives birth to a baby boy, and they name him Isaac, which means he laughs. But then later there's a famous story where God tests Abraham by commanding him to sacrifice his son Isaac. But God intervenes, stopping Abraham and providing a ram instead.
Yeah, so that's Abraham. And then we follow the story of Isaac first, who is getting older, and he marries a woman named Rebekah. And then they have 2 twins. They have 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Of course, Esau is actually the old. It's like you know how twins are always fighting about who's like a minute older? So Esau is the one that's a minute or older, which means he gets the firstborn blessing. But Jacob comes out holding on to Esau's heel, and so he gets named Jacob, which means he who grabs by the heel. So Jacob ends up tricking Isaac into thinking that he's Esau, and he steals the blessing and birthright of the firstborn. But there's these 2 key moments for Jacob, because you kind of think, oh, this guy's not great news. But then God is with him. And so there's these 2 stories. First, there's one where he dreams of a ladder, which reaches all the way up into heaven with angels going up and down on it. And God promises Jacob that his ancestors will inherit the very land that he's on.
One of my favorite paintings is of Jacob's Ladder by William Blake. Blake was a British artist and mystic who had visions, and then he would paint his visions. And I commend it to you, at least give it a Google, to check out all the beautiful angels, and the ladder itself is like a DNA strand. It's so stunning.
There's another icon that I really like by an artist named Lyuba Yatskiv, and it's just a really beautiful painting. It is actually, you know, Jacob's Ladder was really locked onto in the Middle Ages, especially, where it was kind of seen as this analog or picture for the spiritual life of us going up into heaven. Well, so that's the first story. But then the second key story for Jacob is him wrestling with this mysterious figure who turns out to be God. He fights very well, despite that it's God, and he ends up getting renamed. He receives the name Israel.
And what does Israel mean? Because every name has a meaning.
It means he who wrestles with God.
Very good.
So Jacob then meets his future wife, Rachel, And after some trickery from her father, he ends up marrying first Rachel's sister Leah and then Rachel. And through Leah, Rachel, and their 2 servants, Jacob has 12 sons. So he has a really big family.
So God has kept God's promises. The giant family has begun, but it took 3 generations. So this goes to show that God keeps God's promises, but on God's time, not on our time. So the story next shifts to Jacob's favorite son, which was Joseph, through his favorite wife, Rachel. Joseph's brothers are very jealous of Joseph, so they sell him to slave traders who bring him down to Egypt. And he serves Potiphar, the Egyptian captain of the guard, and he does extremely well because he has this ability to predict the future through his dreams. Eventually, he's put in charge of Potiphar's house, but then Potiphar's wife attempts to seduce him. And when Joseph refuses, she accuses him of trying to violate her, and Potiphar throws Joseph in prison. The story has a lot of ups and downs. So while he's in prison, he successfully interprets some fellow prisoners' dreams. And shortly after, Pharaoh has some disturbing dreams that no one can interpret. So he ends up calling on Joseph to interpret. He's heard about him through the grapevine. So Joseph interprets them well, predicting an eventual famine. And Pharaoh ends up putting him in charge of much of his kingdom to prepare for that time. So at the end of the story, the famine does happen. And Joseph's brothers come down to Egypt to ask for grain because they were starving. And eventually they and Jacob are reunited with Joseph. And Joseph remarks that despite their plans for evil, God had a plan for good all along. Mm-hmm. It's really a lovely ending to Genesis. It kind of brings tears to your eyes because Joseph, who's been through so much trauma, he finds peace, and he finds that peace through forgiveness and seeing God's divine hand at work.
Yeah, so that's kind of like a broad overview, a big summary of the book, or of the second half of the book. But, one of the things that's always kind of stood out to me about this half of Genesis is, you would think if God was picking people, right? He'd be picking really great, moral, perfect kind of people, right?
No.
God doesn't pick this family because they're perfect. In fact, they're far from it. I think we probably all have examples that we can think of people who are supposed to follow God, but also maybe don't always do the best things. So first you have Abraham, and Abraham, he is like faithful and righteous sometimes, but then sometimes he just does these kind of inexplicable things. So for example, first Abraham, he puts Sarah in danger like multiple times. First they go to Egypt because there's a famine, and Abraham says to Sarah, "I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they'll say, 'This is his wife.' Then they'll kill me, because they will let you live. Say that you're my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account." So they go into Egypt, and Abram wants Sarah to pretend that she's his sister. So she ends up getting taken into Pharaoh's house, but Pharaoh's afflicted with plagues, and he's like realizing something's wrong. So he calls Abraham to him, and he says, "Why'd you lie to me? Why'd you say that she was your sister when she's definitely your wife?" So he sends them away.
So Abraham repeats this mistake again in Genesis 20, saying Sarah is his sister again with King Abimelech of Gerar. Abimelech decides to take Sarah as his wife, but then God appears to Abimelech in a dream saying, "You are about to die because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a married woman." Again, Abimelech gets upset and sends them away, though this time he gives Abraham a lot of stuff for the journey.
Have you ever gotten in trouble because of something somebody else did?
Well, I think that is particularly true in families where there's a lot of kids. Me personally, I'm an only child.
Yes. What about you, Mike?
I'm not going to tell any of those stories.
Okay. Let's get back to our Bible story. So Isaac repeats this mistake in Genesis 26 when he goes to Gerar and does exactly the same thing with a different king Abimelech, saying that his wife Rebekah was his sister. And after trying to take her as his wife, Abimelech looks out the window to see Isaac and Rebekah embracing and realizes that they are not siblings. So again, he admonishes Isaac, but also declares that they should be safe from all people.
Right. So Isaac really just kind of repeats exactly the same mistakes as his dad. It's really interesting to me. It's like they're almost like scamming people, right? Like they're going into these places and then they get free stuff, and it's kind of a whole like scam thing. So Isaac is really just kind of picking this up from his dad. But, Abraham, he's not just doing that. There's also the whole thing with Hagar. So God had promised to make Abraham the father of a multitude, but there's that problem, right? He and Sarah are super old, and they don't believe that they can have children. They even try, and Sarah doesn't conceive. So she ends up saying, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my slave girl. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listens to the voice of Sarah. There's actually a really interesting parallel between this and the Garden of Eden. There's some language connections. So in the Garden of Eden, it talks about how they saw that the fruit was good and they took, right? And then Adam follows Eve. Well, you have the same motif here. You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So they see the problem. So they take Hagar and so she takes Hagar and gives her to Abram. It says it in the next couple verses. And then Abram listens to the voice of his wife. So there's this really interesting parallel where it's actually like they're kind of repeating the fall. And there's a way in which it shows that like what happens when we sin or do the wrong thing is that we're trying to take God's good plan, right? The things that God said he was going to give us, but then we decide to take matters into our own hands and to do it ourselves.
Put it on our own timeline.
That's right. But then there's Jacob.
Well, Abraham's grandson, Jacob, is pretty much cut from the same cloth as his grandfather. So when he's born, Jacob, coming out second, is born holding on to his brother's heel. And so thus that is why he's named Jacob, which means he who grabs by the heel. But it also means deceiver, and we're going to find out he's a pretty tricky guy. It was almost like he wanted to be the first one to be born, right?
That's
so
right.
He's like pulling on Esau. No, you come back.
Which is a little foreshadowing of things to come.
That's right.
It's funny. So obviously my name's Jacob, and I remember I was a part of a campus ministry in college, and I met this Baptist pastor who was kind of running it. And he meets me, he talks to me, and he asks my name. I tell him my name's Jacob. And he goes, "Oh, I don't know why any parent would want to name their kid that."
Oh, dear.
The deceiver. So that's my name story. And then I told my mom that, and she got kind of upset and was like, "No, it means he who supplants, not deceiver." But the truth is, it actually means both. But Jacob gets a nice turnaround, so we'll get to that later.
Yeah, it takes a while, though. So eventually in Genesis 26, there is this story about Jacob stealing Esau's birthright. And unfortunately, it's rooted in some parental favoritism. We see it again, where Rachel favors Jacob, and she conspires with him to steal the birthright of the firstborn, which is his brother Esau. And they do it through deception. Right? So Rachel hears her husband, Isaac, who his eyesight is failing. Now he's really old. She hears Isaac say to Esau, "Bring me game and prepare for me savory food to eat, that I may bless you before the Lord before I die." Which made a lot of sense because Esau was a hunter. He was a big guy and he was always going out and bringing home stuff for the family. Whereas Jacob, he stayed a little bit closer to home with his mom. So Rachel then tells Jacob to make the food and ask for the blessing since Isaac is pretty much blind. But Jacob says, "I can't. My arms are too smooth." Esau is super hairy. And Isaac will touch him and find out.
That'd be kind of like if I were trying to get Mike's blessing,
Yeah, my arms are really hairy.
And that's so funny every Christmas when Mike plays Santa, because Santa has very hairy arms.
The hairiest of arms.
And I don't.
People ask me all the time, "Aren't you cold?" And I'm like, "No, I have a sweater on under my shirt."
I'm going to start calling you Esau.
Yes, that'll be all right.
Okay, so Jacob says his arms are too smooth because Esau's are so hairy, and that Isaac will touch him and find out. But Rachel tells him not to worry. She has a plan, right? She has him put on Esau's clothes and to put goat skins on his forearm so that when his father reaches out, he'll feel just like his brother Esau. So then Jacob does deceive Isaac in this way, and Isaac gives him Esau's blessing.
And then there's like this other sign of Jacob's brokenness too, right?
Right. So again, it's that whole favoring thing, right? So favoring of one of his sons, Joseph. There's this brokenness of the brothers selling Joseph into slavery. They just let their jealousy take over their senses, and they decided that they wanted to get rid of him, and they kind of planned this whole conspiracy. But there's this small parallel here with Cain and Abel, where the younger brother has favor, provoking the jealousy of the older.
Yeah, it's we didn't mention this before, but they actually plan to kill Joseph. They don't just plan to sell him in slavery. And it's Reuben who is kind of like, "Hey, actually, let's just put him in a hole in the ground, and then there's some slave traders coming, and we can just sell him and get some money." But yeah, they were planning on killing him. But you can kind of see in all of these stories, God's own chosen people act in ways that fail to trust God. There's a pattern. It's really like present in that story with Hagar, right? We take matters into our own hands, and we're actually taking things that God actually promised us, but we're taking the matters into our own hands and doing them our way.
We're playing God.
Exactly.
Right? We're taking control. We're not trusting him fully. So I got this one. You just stand back, God. I know you've shown me the way, and I know you held my hand and guided me through my whole life and all these problems, and you are my light. But this one thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the servant girl and have a baby, or I'm going to bury my brother in a hole, or I'm going to do it on my own without your blessing.
Right. Well, it kind of shows how we can have goodish intentions, but still be doing the wrong thing. They're all trying to get what God had promised them, but they're trying to do it their own way. They're trying to be God in that way. But throughout the entire story, even though the covenant people are not always the best, God's faithful to them anyway. And so first, we already referenced it, there's that covenant with Abraham. In Genesis 15, we really get kind of a fuller picture of that covenant, because not only has God promised to make Abraham a great nation, but when you get to Genesis 15, he actually performs this ratification ceremony. Abraham says to God, "How am I supposed to know that I'm going to possess it, or the land?" is really what he's asking. Like, how do I know, God, that you're going to do all of these promises that you made me? So God says, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And do you remember what he does with all of those animals?
Does he split them open?
Yeah.
In half.
He cuts them in half. And so God instructs them to cut them in half and lay them all out. Now this seems really weird to our modern ears, but what this would have been immediately evoking for people in the ancient world is this ceremony that ancient Near Eastern kings, for example, would do with one another. And it was a covenant ratification ceremony. So they would all cut animals in half, and both parties would walk through the halves, and it signified basically an oath. If I were to break this covenant, may the gods do to me as we have done to these animals.
No, thank you.
Exactly. But you'll notice something in the story is that only one party of the covenant walks through the two halves. God sends a cloud that goes through the halves of the animals. So God walks through the halves of the animals, but Abraham doesn't have to. And so what that signifies is that this is a divine grant, a royal grant. In other words, God is making this promise unilaterally. He is saying, I'm going to keep the promise. There is nothing that you have to do.
So notice too how in the story with Hagar, even though God had not chosen Ishmael, a great multitude will come from him as well. And God promises to take care of Hagar and Ishmael. So Hagar and Ishmael are considered the ancestors of the Islamic people. And their stories is a treasured part of the Islamic tradition. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the whole picture, you can see that Abraham is the common father of the three major monotheistic religions in our world: Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Mm-hmm. But back to Hagar. After she flees, God says to her through the angel, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude, which is so much like what he said to Abraham through Sarah, that there would be more offspring than the number of stars in the sky and the number of grains of sand in the desert.
I think one of the things that story really draws out is this idea that with God's grace and God's favor, there's enough to go around. Like there's more than enough to go around. It's not limited just to, one person or a few people. And so you have this theme that appears throughout the rest of the Bible, really, of God's care for the downtrodden and oppressed. So he doesn't forget Hagar, even though she is, not the focus of the story. She's not the line that will produce Israel. God doesn't forget her.
Yeah, I have so many people saying, well, I don't see Jesus in my life. And I say, if you want to see Jesus, go to the margins, right? Because God remembers all the downtrodden, all the oppressed.
That's why he sent his only son.
Exactly. To work on the margins.
That's right.
So the Islamic people are God's people.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is an interesting point that, in many ways, God's favor ends up with the people that would become the Arabian Peninsula, which would become the Islamic peoples. And so, none of us necessarily have a monopoly on God's favor, I guess, is maybe another lesson from this. But then you get to that story of Jacob, right? Jacob wrestles with God, and then his name is changed to Israel. So even though Jacob himself is this kind of seedy deceiver type character, right? We find in Genesis 32, Jacob ends up by the side of this stream, and there's this man who ends up just going up to him and starts wrestling him until daybreak. So a really long time. And when the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So the implication is kind of that Jacob wrestled with God. And what's so crazy about that is that he wins, kind of. And so
Well, after he gets his hip broken.
after he gets his hip broken. But he holds on to him. It's like this characteristic Jacob moment, right? He clings on to him and says, "I'm not going to let you go until you bless me."
Just like he did with Esau.
Exactly, yeah. He's like, I'm getting that blessing one way or another. And there's kind of, there's kind of something to that, right? Is in our own lives when we want something from God, when we want God, right? Then we hold on, right? We just keep on keeping on and we go for it. Maybe not in exactly the way that Jacob did, but there is something to be said for that kind of persistence that Jacob has. And God decides to favor Jacob, even though I think most people would say Jacob probably doesn't deserve it.
So with Joseph, we find that God was with him through every part of his story, all the ups and downs, and that his brothers sinned against him, ended up with him being second in command to the Pharaoh in Egypt. So, as Joseph says in Genesis 50:20, which is so transformational, it's where he finds peace and forgiveness by realizing all along that he was an instrument of God. He says, "Even though you intended to do me harm, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today." So, Mike, what does this mean to you in your life?
So I ask God every day to forgive me my trespasses as I forgive those who trespass against me. Just kind of like I also ask him every day when I say the St. Francis prayer that God grant that I comfort rather than be comforted, and understand rather than be understood, and to love rather than to be loved. And then I have to forgive in order to be forgiven. So I have this process in my life of these things that I have done in the past that I can't get free of unless I put them on paper and I make amends to these people, and I go out and I say, "Hey," I knock on the door, "Hey, this is Mike, and I'm here to make right these things." A lot of times it's not just paying the bill back or asking for saying I'm sorry, because a lot of times I'm sorry won't fill the bill. It's more of what can I do, and a lot of times I just listen, to what they have to say, and most of the time it's just you keep doing good, and you keep doing okay, and you're forgiven, and then I can go on and forgive them as well.
There's also this tremendous power in what Joseph says, because not only do we see the fruits of that forgiveness that you're talking about, but we also see that in our own lives things go wrong, right? Life is not always great, and a lot of times it can be very, very difficult to see past what is happening right now, and there's this lingering question of why is God letting this happen? Why is this happening to me? And we see in this passage with Joseph, what you intended for harm, God intended for good.
God makes lemonade out of lemons.
Yeah. There's this idea that everything that's happening in our lives, in our world, is going to something good. It's going towards something good. And that's tremendously comforting, I think.
I see that when I look at the cross, the transformation that happens from the Good Friday cross to the Easter cross.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's this idea that God's going to turn everything around. He's going to resurrect, renew, remake everything. Everything's going to be new.
Using every part of your life.
Mm-hmm.
So nothing is wasted.
Right.
It's all used by God.
Mm-hmm.
The good and the bad.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so really, I guess where we might end is to talk about how all of this leads to Jesus. We've already started doing that just now. But, we talked about, for example, the Abrahamic covenant or the new covenant. And I was reminded of that passage in Galatians 3:6, where Paul says, "Just as Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, so you see, those who believe are the descendants of Abraham." And this kind of gets at a larger strand of Paul's thought, where he's talking about how the people who follow God now, no matter where they're from, by the way, or who they are, or what their background is, or their or any of that, they are descendants of Abraham. You remember how how God said to Abraham, "Through you I will bless all nations." That covenant expands to the whole world. And so we're all in this covenant that God made with Abraham. We're all recipients of that same grace that God gave to Abraham. But then there's also the Isaac and the ram story, right? Do you know the connection between Isaac and the ram? It's a perplexing story, right? Is Isaac, God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac and then stops him, and then a ram appears.
It seems to be a test of Abraham's obedience to God.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, it is this test to see whether Abraham is willing to give up everything, right? But
Even
then
his most cherished child.
Exactly.
Right,
yeah,
his only
he's
child.
not holding anything back. Even, by the way, God's promise to him, right? Isaac was God's promise. So Abraham must know that God will find a way. And so he doesn't withhold anything, even though it doesn't make sense.
He trusts God with all of his heart,
That's
mind,
right.
and soul.
That's right. And it's foreshadowing of what God's going to do. And we know it's foreshadowing because of the ram. The ram is...
Jesus.
Exactly. Yes. The ram, the church has always interpreted the ram as being a archetype or a prefiguring of Jesus. And so God's going to do what he asked Abraham to do. He's going to give up his son. And he's not going to hold anything back. And he's going to make sure that we are all part of this promise that was given to Abraham.
That's so beautiful.
So that's the rest of Genesis. So we're finally through Genesis, and next week we are going to do...
Exodus.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So next week is Moses and floodwaters and pharaohs and all that fun stuff.
I can't wait.
Thanks for listening to the Fig Tree Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing this podcast on social media so others can join us. We hope that you have a great day, and we'll see you next time on the Fig Tree Podcast.